Morning, everyone. I'm Zach Schloss, Director of UX Strategy at One North. My team is a strategy team, so much like some of the other strategy directors that you see today, we are often thinking a little bit upstream, so we already have that advantage. But when it comes to UX, as Khaled pointed out, it's often very tactical. We're very in the weeds in terms of shipping something tomorrow. And we're working alongside technologists who have very real pressures to get something out the door. The way that we start to take a longer-term view, though, is by zooming out a little bit. And we saw Khaled's presentation really think about what is the story that we're telling, and if we only take a narrow slice, we may end up with something that isn't giving the whole story. And unfortunately, when it comes to UX, we're often thinking about users today. We're thinking about backwards-facing data. How are they performing on the reports that we just received? And we're facing realities of needing to do research kind of in the trenches. We have a prototype. We need to go test it. We're not always given the luxury of, let's go out into the field. Let's talk to people. Let's discover what their future needs might be. So when it comes to how UX has been operating for the past, I would say, decade or more, there's been this theory of lean UX, which is really born out of Silicon Valley's lean startup. And it basically says that we all need to move fast and break things in order to get anywhere. And I think we've heard even from Dory, there's a time and a place for some of that short-term thinking. But that whole lean ideology was born out of these cash-strapped startups that had to move fast, that had to quickly prove value. For million, billion, trillion-dollar enterprises, they don't have to move that fast. And they can take time to really imagine that longer-term future. Also, when we're moving fast, we're more likely going to be leaning into biases based on what we already know, and that's going to end up with the same UX patterns that we used yesterday. It's not going to necessarily end up in something wholly new. Oftentimes, we're talking about the happy path. You might have heard this or seen a diagram like this if you are working with UXer. And it reinforces those biases. It's like, well, we've got to get the thing that's going to work for the most people the fastest. And the team that we have working on this, they already pretty much know the user and what the problem is, so we're just going to go forward with it. But what ends up happening is we get down the road and we haven't built a product that can scale globally or can scale for more inclusive audiences. At best, our UX practice does incorporate research, and you may have seen something like this if you were involved in a brainstorming session using user data. But again, if our research is only focused narrowly on the problems we're trying to solve today or that we've already defined well, that's where the research is going to stay as too. And so the research itself, the UX strategy, is only good as the vision that we're setting out. And it really needs to align to a longer-term business strategy as well. So we need our sort of business leaders to say, it's good to take this long-term view. We want to partner with our technology strategists and think bigger picture and do some of that research that might not necessarily be applicable to the thing we're building right now, but something that is sort of coming up down the road. So it really takes defining a longer-term vision. And I've got a couple examples today that I want to point out how sort of setting a vision might get you on the right path. But I'm a big Trekkie, so I had to include this in here. How are we going to create enterprise-grade solutions if we aren't thinking large enough? And obviously, to create something like a starship, we would need to think pretty long-term and not need to be so biased in what we've already built before. And also, after 3 decades on the web, our users really do expect more. If I'm doing business with a $1 trillion enterprise and their thing is broken or doesn't serve me, it's going to leave an impression. Maybe this isn't the type of company that I want to be doing business with. So, how do we, one more Star Trek reference, that's it, I promise. How do we explore these new worlds? How do we go beyond where we are today? Go where no one has gone before? As the sort of long view, 10 years out, that's been proposed by some of the other speakers. From a UX strategy perspective, I think it really comes down to our process and approach and the language that we use. Oftentimes when we're around the table today, we're talking about functional requirements, user stories, and hopefully we're talking about usability. We're talking about, are we testing what we're building? But less often are we asking ourselves the question, how inclusive is what we're building for all the different types of people who need to access our business? How safe is what we're building for everyone who will have access to this technology? I think those two words are coming up a little less often. This may not be an exhaustive list. There probably are others that need to be thought on, but my point is that as we move forward in terms of thinking big picture and long-term about UX, we have to move beyond the status quo of just making something that's functional or usable. And I've got a couple examples to walk through. So imagine you're back in the mid-2000s and you're creating a social network. There are many to choose from, but when we're setting out an initial vision, it's about something that is going to gain attention, gain users, gain clicks and engagement, probably some ad sales. And the only way that we're going to get there anytime soon is by moving pretty quickly, kind of taking that lean approach. Eventually, we're going to have to leverage some user data to really build some compelling algorithms that pull people back in and get them engaged. But as you see on the right-hand column here, this vision is all about the business. It's about how are we functionally going to get this off the ground and sort of focus on growth. And I'm here to say that if we're not at all focused on the quality of the engagement, if the only metric is growth, we're going to end up with something that maybe is kind of ugly in the way that it operates, in the way that people end up using it. And eventually, this strategy is just going to become old. It's no longer going to serve us as it once did in an early stage startup environment. We can't be breaking shit when we're talking about users' data 10, 15 years down the road. And lastly, these algorithms that we've been building to create sort of these viral reactions that really get people fired up, eventually are going to show that they cause harm. And so if we're not taking a long view about the core of our product and how we're trying to drive engagement, we're going to end up sacrificing something. And it's probably the quality of the experience, the safety of our users, and then we're going to end up trying to fix it with some short-term thinking, like safety settings. I'm sure at some point this was not a great room to be in, but these were reactionary. There was abuse happening on the platform, and we had to find a way to make it, stop the bleeding. So, you can block a user. This is the new feature. Meanwhile, it never actually got to the root problem, which was that the algorithm and the way that this entire product was designed from the beginning never really intended to create sort of safeguards or a user-centered version of a product that really focused on quality of the engagement. We all know how the story ends, or is progressing. These networks are seeing decline in usage, and we're actually now seeing experts come out and say they're causing harm. So kind of taking that step back again, what if there was longer term thinking? And I'm not saying that there wasn't. I'm sure there were many people inside these organizations doing a lot of activities, but it didn't seem to make it to the top in a way that allowed them to really move in a direction that could have avoided some of now a reversal of success of their business. So I really think in addition to obviously building something that's functional, we need to pay attention to the quality of the user experience, how the users are being impacted, and sort of the long term of what that experience sort of provides on the society at large, especially as it scales up to be something that is beyond just a small group of people. So quality and impact naturally lead us to talk a little bit more about usability. If something is usable, we often say it's user-friendly, and we report that it causes less headaches and is less of a pain to use. I think a great example of this was cell phone hardware. Again, there are many examples to choose from. But immediately, they were faced with, people are going to be carrying around a computer in their pocket. What if it gets lost? What if there's data on that device? we had to think about some of the qualities of using this device every day, and that really impacted the vision for what it was like to build this device and to design it. The first devices came with data security built in. It wasn't something that we had to ask for. It wasn't an afterthought. And in order for them to get to a state of actually launching a product like that, they have to be incredibly thoughtful about that whole design process. They couldn't just ship it quickly and hope for the best. They had to actually design something that was more foolproof. So we start to see how this version of a vision is more user-centric. It is including some of the basic needs of what it's like to have this hardware in your life every single day. And it's creating something that is a little more sustainable in terms of experience that you trust long term. Apple, of course, famously built in a lot of privacy settings, and I've got a couple more to point out. But they took a while to take a broader vision about how they can include all different types of people within their functionality. And they weren't necessarily seeing ahead of all of that inclusive design at the very beginning. They knew they needed to launch something first. So thankfully, they did iterate over time. They have been introducing more features. And they thought more holistically about what it means to use something long term. A lot of folks are keeping these devices longer than ever before. And they've introduced features to be able to service the device on your own, recognizing that, again, you're carrying around a piece of glass that's probably going to break at some point. They've started to take more holistic visions and user-centric versions of their entire product design ecosystem. So it's not just the hardware, not just the software, but it's the entire experience of using it. So they're broadening the definition of usable. It isn't just can this button be clicked, or do I understand what to do on this screen? In this way, they've really been sort of democratizing access to their platforms and technologies. Now you can buy a less expensive version. Maybe the features are a little bit different in terms of the camera performance, but it still has some of the basics around security and repairability. So they're thinking broader and bigger about how their technologies that they're building are kind of creating a more inclusive and accessible world. Which takes us right into the next topic. When we're thinking about democratizing access to technology, we're thinking about all the different needs that people might have when they use it. So a great example, Amazon Alexa or Google Home or any of the other devices immediately democratized access to information. You no longer had to have a screen that required interaction or touch, having a voice UI. But they sort of went even further with some of the features. They were thinking about, okay, if the primary means of interaction is through voice, then we may need to think about how someone is using that voice UI. So they built in speech speed control. And the really beautiful aspect of this feature is that it benefits different people in different ways. So if you need it to go fast because you're a power user, if you need it to go slow because you're hard of hearing, or need it to go slow simply because you don't want to have it repeat itself or have to ask it to repeat itself, when we're building features that are more universally needed and accessible, we're actually creating a more inclusive future in terms of our products. A couple other examples. I got to include this in my speech. It's the only time we're going to talk about Vision Pro today. But they inherently took their time. They weren't first to market necessarily. They weren't breaking things quickly to try and figure it out in the marketplace. I'm sure they were behind the scenes. They took a different approach. They recognized sort of the shortcomings of some of the prior VR headsets. When someone is in a fully VR environment, it's disorienting. It's hard to use. It causes people to need to take it off and take a break. So they were like, we're going to make this thing transparent. We're going to create something that's mixed reality, that allows you to still see what items are in your living room so you're not tripping over them, or if another person comes into your field of vision. They recognize that there are ways to push beyond this new era of spatial computing and think a little bit differently about the form factor and the accessibility so that more people could pick up the device and more easily use it. In that way, they're thinking more inclusively beyond sort of the status quo. So a couple key inclusive considerations to keep in mind. It oftentimes does mean that the team itself needs to be diverse or really informed by a representative population. These ideas aren't just going to sort of come out of thin air. And it needs to recognize that things are going to change. We're not going to uphold the status quo, and that might upset or ruffle a few feathers. There may have been some ideas before that the team had that we need to backtrack on or change. So some of these longer-term thinkings when it comes to UX strategy mean that we are going to have to make change within our processes, within our organization. And I think designers are uniquely positioned to really intervene and help take that action to, as we so famously always say, represent the voice of the user, but start to represent all users. It's going to take some time and probably alignment at a business level that the future state of our business or of our products and services really does mean opening up the technology to a broader audience. So I think the best design really does create these better experiences for everyone. And if we're not being inclusive in our measurement in terms of the outcomes and the quality that we're seeking, we're not going to end up anywhere near a long-term better future. Creating a better experience for everyone also includes thinking about how sometimes our products can be used by bad actors. Not everyone is going to be thinking the way we are in terms of a happy path or sort of the bare minimum. Great example of this, Uber Australia actually introduced a feature for women drivers. They recognize that historically there has been violence against women in general, but also in this setting, and they sort of reached a point where this was now a business risk. So they empowered their design team to think more inclusively about the individual and unique needs of their different users and segments, and they came up with a feature that allowed women and female identifying drivers to actually click a feature to say, I only want to pick up other women or other female identifying drivers or riders because I'm going to feel more safe at work. So what it did is it allowed their team to actually think a little more segmented about specific features. It helped actually improve the long-term aspects of their business performance. They're no longer having to deal with some of these violence-related business issues. And it actually empowered their business to grow, because now more women are feeling comfortable stepping into this role and taking on other women drivers. Another good example that I think is a little bit bucking the trend right now, we're seeing touchscreens being put into every vehicle. Hyundai actually has kind of taken a strong stance that physical buttons are safest, and they're putting safety first. They're saying that we're recognizing that the safety of individuals who use our products is sort of more important than being flashy or trendy, kind of going after the shiny, as Kevin said. And I think this inherently makes sense for anyone who's ever driven a car. I expect to see this happen more and more in different areas where maybe we're used to having a touch screen, but return to physical buttons. A good example, going back to the Amazon Alexa, if I want to make sure that mic is muted, having a hard button to create a safe or secure environment is going to make me feel a lot better. Finally, last Apple example here. I think I'm most quoting Apple today. They recognize that their location sharing data could cause a lot of problems, that there were a lot of bad actors who were using it to track people. And so they built in functionality that made it easy to uncover who exactly has access to this information, and then also built in an emergency out button. So if you were ever in a situation where you needed to just cut off all access quickly, they recognize that although this technology is incredibly powerful, incredibly useful, it's enabling us to do so much with these location-based services, sometimes those services aren't serving us, and we need to build in additional safety for end users. Again, they're finding ways to sort of reduce harm through their product. So they're taking this long-term view. I'm going to build hardware, I'm going to build software, I'm going to build a vehicle, I'm going to build a platform or business or service, but I want to make sure that it has sustainability in terms of being in business 10 years from now. I want to make sure that some bad actor doesn't come in and cause harm in ways that we were just kind of too lazy to think about. We just didn't spend the time now to sort of get ahead of it. And I think that's the key here, is that a little bit of investment now is going to pay off long term. So a couple key safety considerations, just because I know this might be a newer one in terms of the UX field. Hackers are not the only ones out there that are using technologies in bad ways. When we're sitting around the design table, we're rarely asking, how could someone use this product potentially to harm someone? Our regular research that we're already doing, the scope of it may be fairly narrow. It may not actually be looking at some of these other scenarios. So in general, stress testing some of the ideas that we have around new product features is a good idea. Again, I think designers are really in a unique position to help here. We can advocate for the user, and we can design materials like we do every day with personas and journey maps that are informed by research that help to build empathy across our product teams that make these scenarios more real. There's a great book, Designing for Safety. I cannot take all the credit here, but there's a lot of practical tips in here, like building in speed bumps. We talk a lot about frictionless experiences in UX, but sometimes a little bit of friction is a good thing. For example, if a product is built to recognize abusive patterns, let's say someone is constantly checking up on someone's location, maybe we send someone a notification, hey, you're still sharing your location with this person. Do you still want to do that? If we're thinking smarter about how the technology is designed and how it operates, we're ultimately going to build something that's going to keep people safe for the long term. So obviously, we're never going to create the perfect solution, but starting to understand where harm occurs can help to lead us towards a better future that allows us to start to address it. So I've got these kind of 4 user agreements. They were definitely inspired by the 4 agreements, if anyone has read that book before. But I'm sort of challenging us to bring these to the table. It's no longer enough to say, what is the functionality that's been prescribed by the requirements? What is the prototype that we just tested in terms of the results? How can we optimize the button placement, for example? But how is it serving the broader people who need access to our business and services? And how is it ensuring that long term it's going to end up keeping people safe? So I really do feel like these 4 agreements are that foundation, and a couple great ways to get started are starting to look at some of your segmentation. Are you including some of those historically marginalized segments as part of your thinking? And in terms of safety, are you doing stress testing? Are you thinking critically enough? Obviously, data privacy and security is almost always top of mind within IT teams, but how users have control over their data really needs to be considered more broadly.